HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Americans in a World at War, Intimate Histories from the Crash of Pan Am's Yankee Clipper, by Brooke L. Blower, read by Nancy Peterson. Dead people never stop talking, and sometimes the living hear. Marlon James, A Brief History of 7 Killings, 2014. Preface. On February 21, 1943, the celebrated Pan Am Airways seaplane, the Yankee Clipper, took off from New York's Marine Air Terminal and island-hopped its way across the Atlantic Ocean. Arriving at Lisbon the following evening, it crashed in the Tagus River, killing 24 of the 39 passengers and crew on board. This book traces the backstories of 7 people on that plane. 7 worldly Americans, their personal histories, their politics, and the paths that led them toward war. Only 2 of them would survive the crash. Combat soldiers made up only a small fraction of the millions of Americans, both in and out of uniform, who scattered across 6 continents on the eve of and during the Second World War. Long before GIs began storming beaches, and beyond the war's most famous battlefields, Americans forged extensive political and economic ties to other parts of the world. Between spring 1939 and fall 1945, Pan Am's regular transatlantic service alone transported 83,000 non-combatants back and forth across the ocean. Tens of thousands more traveled along the airline's Pacific, Latin American, and African routes. Filing down the gangplank went bankers, oil brokers, ordnance experts, physicists, farmers, photographers, purchasing agents, plastic surgeons, statisticians, civil defense planners, fact-finding politicians, radio announcers, and more. Americans in a World at War revives this panoramic and often surprising history of how a diverse cast of people were drawn into global crisis, how they navigated an era of unprecedented mobility and perilous interdependence, and how their deep and sometimes contradictory international engagements would shape and, in turn, be strengthened, transformed, or else derailed by the U.S. war effort. It is a story about Americans in the world before the Allies were winning. Hindsight can teach us how and why the Allies prevailed in the Second World War. But thinking forward in time through the eyes of individuals instead dramatizes how much Americans headed into the conflict not with ultimate victory in view, but still grappling with the fallout from previous battles, and still consumed by the passions and partisan divides of the 1920s and 1930s. It brings to life the singular emotions, the worry and fright, as well as the contingencies and unknowns of the war's early years. It drives home how quickly the international order can collapse, and how fragile the future of democracy can be. The individuals profiled here are not stand-ins for larger groups. They are complex people who were in some ways representative, but in other ways exceptional. They lived lives of contradiction and complication, like most human beings. As their biographies accumulate, intersect, and sometimes work at cross purposes, they defy expectations, spilling out over social categories, national borders, time periods, and other schemes for order. They put flesh and bone to otherwise hard-to-grasp events of global scope, and invite those who follow them to revisit even well-known history with fresh eyes. They help to better situate the early 20th century United States in the stream of world history. Americans in this era, even many of those labeled isolationists by their opponents, were remarkably cosmopolitan. Indeed, they were curious and worldly in ways that Americans no longer needed to be after the United States emerged as a superpower at the end of the war. It's just that they did not agree about diplomacy and military strategy, the purpose of government, the place of women and people of color in their society, the role of the press, the merits of capitalism and communism, and the future of the planet's colonies. The worldviews of the Yankee Clipper's passengers spanned the political spectrum. Some were progressive, others were conservative. One leaned toward socialism, another toward fascism. This is not surprising, given their diverse regional, professional, and family backgrounds. Of the 7 travelers profiled here, all but one of them was a child or a grandchild of immigrants. And 2 of them were immigrants themselves. They came from families of Irish and Spanish Catholics, Southern Evangelical and mainline East Coast Protestants, Old Stock German, and newly arrived Russian-speaking Jews. Among them, they knew almost a dozen different languages, and at formative moments had lived in Spain, France, Romania, Ukraine, Panama, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Netherlands East Indies. Wartime commitments, which for many of them began before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, would take them to India, Australia, England, Egypt, Brazil, Portugal, the Soviet Union, and the Belgian Congo, among other places. As these Americans crisscrossed the globe, they found their beliefs sorely tested. 2 of them would find their work the subject of angry congressional hearings. Another would be arrested on suspicion of aiding the enemy. Together, their actions do not amount to a united national crusade, but rather stand as a testament to the variety, ingenuity, and sometimes folly of Americans' wartime endeavors, and to the cumulative impact of a series of separate decisions that hurtled a group of strange compatriots toward one shared tragedy that cost 5 of them their lives. Not so long ago, an attempt to trace the stories gathered here would have ended after an unsuccessful flip through the phone book. But online search engines make it possible to track everyday people like never before. Electronic databases yielded up census records and passport applications. Word-searchable newspapers unearthed other enticing clues, which in turn led to alumni records, love letters, and FBI files. The ability to find some of the Yankee Clipper passengers' living relatives at the stroke of a keyboard produced yet more material gathering dust in family basements and closets. Century-old correspondence on parchment paper, scrapbooks encrusted with ration coupons and yellowing photographs, steamer trunks stuffed with business records and journals. In addition to writing biographies about people because they embody something we deem important in retrospect, and because they deemed themselves important enough to leave an archive, it is now possible to write about people simply to see where they can take us. Places we might otherwise never think to go. A note on names and language. One of this book's central subjects, Tamra, preferred to be known only by her first name. To avoid calling the only woman in the group by her first name while identifying men by their last names, all the main characters and their close confidants are referred to by first names, sometimes nicknames. Perhaps this is fitting for such intimate stories. Famous figures who make cameo appearances are identified by their full or last names. The surnames of Manuel and his business partner Marcelino Garcia Rubiera originally included accents in Spanish, but in forming their New York company, they dropped the accents. In Spain, a person's name customarily includes 3 parts: a given name, a father's surname, followed by a mother's maiden name. Japanese and Chinese surnames appear first, given names second. Chinese words are rendered in pinyin, except when alternative romanizations are more recognizable. Chiang Kai-shek, rather than Jiang Jieshi. And for established institutions, Peking Union Medical College. Place name spellings preferred by locals are employed whenever possible. But in cases where doing so would introduce historical inaccuracy, colonial terms are preserved. Leopoldville versus Kinshasa, Netherlands East Indies versus Indonesia. Black and white are both capitalized when referring to historically constructed and consequential racial identities. Spurious concepts such as white supremacy and white virtue, however, remain lowercase. Quotations from Ben's notes, dispatches, and telegrams, which he often drafted in cablese, have been converted into regular English for easier understanding. Translations from Russian are by April French. Interpretations of French, Spanish, and Dutch are sources by the author. Nothing that follows has been embellished. All dialogue and details derive from letters, testimony, and other historical documents, but with care and cross-checking. Newspaper accounts often contain inaccuracies. Public records can be wrong. People omit or exaggerate, misremember, mislead, and sometimes lie. Introduction. Into the Vortex. The plane was delayed by almost a week. First for maintenance, a backfiring engine, a warped exhaust valve, a sticky piston, then crew illness, then weather conditions. This was not uncommon. Regular transatlantic air service to Portugal, where passengers caught connecting flights to the British Isles, North Africa, and other danger zones, had been running for less than 4 years, only since the spring before Adolf Hitler's forces invaded Poland. Fingerprinted, passported, and vaccinated, travelers awaited their boarding instructions in New York apartments and hotel rooms, smoking cigarettes, listening to the radio, or reading the latest about the war. Frank Kuehl was anxious to get going. New York was driving him batty. The Olympic athlete turned export salesman had spent the previous decade living it up as a bachelor in colonial Southeast Asia, until forced to flee and almost killed by the Japanese. Camped out at Greenwich Village's Hotel Lafayette, he likely pored over reports that U.S. Marines had finally clawed their way to full control of Guadalcanal, even though costly naval and air skirmishes continued around the Solomon Islands. He would have read about North Africa, too, where he was headed, after talking his way into a job with the Mutual Broadcasting System, and where untested American troops had just been humbled by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's tanks in their first face-to-face engagement with the Germans near Tunisia's Kasserine Pass. "It rather looks as though I shall be on my way in a very few days," he wrote to his sister on February 14th. When he got there, he told her she might be able to hear him on the radio every night. He would keep close to the action, and when the drive on Europe began, he would be right up there with the first ones. At her penthouse, just off Central Park West, Broadway star Tamara Drasen-Swan packed her things: a shoebox, a hatbox, a suitcase piled with evening gowns, costume jewelry, hair clips, lipstick, and sheet music. By February 19th, she and other members of her USO Camp Shows troupe knew that they would be embarking first to England and then to further combat areas to entertain Allied forces. Cultivating the persona of a mysterious Russian songstress, Tamara had been known only by her first name, and hiding her Jewish background since 1933, when she found fame debuting the ballad "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes." But she often thought of her traumatic escape from war-torn Ukraine in 1920, and the grandmother she left behind, and who was by now almost surely gone. At his Upper East Side townhouse, George Spiegelberg, a 6-foot-tall hazel-eyed major on General Dwight D. Eisenhower's London staff, was enjoying a brief reunion with his wife and small children after nearly a year's absence. The stern Republican lawyer was no fan of President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal, but he was thrilled to have the Wartime Overseas Commission he had been dreaming about since 1918. When his brother found glory as an aviator in France, while he remained stateside, charged with procuring local supplies to feed, house, and equip U.S. forces in Britain, he had been temporarily recalled to Washington to defend the merits of Lend-Lease against skeptics in his own party. Now set to return to his post, he also readied his belongings: woolen underwear and socks, a shaving brush, vitamin tablets, a made-in-England U.S. Army uniform, and a standard-issue Colt .45 automatic pistol. The city's newspapers hardly captured the horrors these and 36 other Americans would soon be speeding toward at more than 150 miles per hour. In Europe, the Third Reich ruled over a larger and more populated landmass than that of the United States. Relying on brute force rather than administrative savvy, Axis leaders were growing harsher in their reprisals against every hint of resistance. In France, under total occupation since November, deportations to the death camps had resumed, and a new compulsory labor service had just been announced. Marseille, once a beacon of hope for refugees, strained under martial law and the whims of the SS regiment Hitler sent there to cleanse the Mediterranean port of its undesirables. Only days earlier, the occupiers had finished systematically ransacking and demolishing the town's entire historic district. Eastern Europe suffered even worse in the crossfire between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army. After months of gruesome house-to-house combat, and at the cost of more men than the United States would lose in the entire war, Soviet fighters had just wrested from the encircled German Sixth Army the uninhabitable wasteland that was once Stalingrad. But Einsatzgruppen and SS execution squads, armed with daily kill quotas, continued to liquidate ghettos and entire villages in Belarus and Ukraine, slowed only by the challenge of burning or burying so many bodies in winter. Beyond the places where labor camps were even bothered with, in regions that would never be seen by liberators from the West, Germans and their collaborators shot entire families over mass graves, sometimes shoving the youngest into the pits alive. The specially built Zyklon B chambers and crematoria of Birkenau would not be operational until the following month, but more than 3/4 of the Holocaust's victims were already dead. At the other end of the Eurasian continent, Greater Japan had also reached its outward limits, stretching from Burma to the borders of Siberia on mainland China, across to the U.S. Aleutian Islands at the edge of the Bering Sea, and down to Portuguese Timor, less than 500 miles from northwest Australia. During the previous year, the Empire's soldiers, who now ruled over some 350 million people, had slaughtered or marched to their death untold millions of resistors and ethnic Chinese as they raped and pillaged their way through Shanghai, Saigon, Bangkok, Hong Kong, Manila, Singapore, and Batavia. Japanese guards also controlled the fates of some 350,000 American and European civilians and POWs, confined to rapidly deteriorating camps. Some of them were Frank Kewell's friends. But few outside the region fathomed the extent to which these populations were being brutalized. Few knew about the sexual enslavement of comfort women, or that Japanese scientists were spreading plague and other infectious diseases among unsuspecting peasants and conducting surgical experiments on human test subjects. The nightmares of that winter, the cheapening of life, extended far beyond these occupied zones. In China's Henan province, millions starved as local corruption exacerbated the pain of the previous year's harvest failure. Families were eating leaves and peanut husks and selling their children. In Bengal, poor weather and pest infestations had also destroyed the season's rice crop. With overland imports blocked by the closure of the Burma Road and food stores throughout India alarmingly low, pleas for relief shipments had been pouring into London for weeks. Nevertheless, British officials were diverting more ships away from the colony for use in the Atlantic, a decision that would cost the lives of 3 million people. The stakes of the global crisis by February 1943, which some Americans were beginning to call World War II, had escalated to ghastly heights. Promoting the new objective of unconditional surrender, which he and Winston Churchill formulated weeks before during their conference at Casablanca, Franklin Roosevelt insisted that Americans would fight through to the finish and impose punishment and retribution in full. Germany's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, thundered back over the international airwaves, promising conflict more total and more radical than we can even imagine it today. Like a vortex, this war devoured not just battlefields and their soldiers, but everything and everyone in its vicinity. The majority of its 60 million fatalities would be civilians. On February 21st, Pan American Airways finally summoned passengers for trip 9035 to LaGuardia's sleek Art Deco Marine Air Terminal. The comings and goings of the airline's giant clippers used to be celebrated by newsreel cameramen, who once lingered in the skylit rotunda, hoping for glimpses of disembarking celebrities and statesmen, and sightseers who paid a dime to crowd the observation deck and watch the flying boat lift off from Long Island Sound. But now, ground crew, sworn to uphold the Espionage Act, closely guarded schedules and manifests. Japanese forces had overrun Pan Am's string of Pacific bases from Midway to Hong Kong, killing or capturing more than 90 of the airline's employees. It was not inconceivable that the Axis might target the company's Atlantic network too. The Clipper's wings and tails still displayed commercial registration marks, requisites for safe passage to neutral Portuguese territories. But they had an obvious utility for the Allied war effort as the world's only aircraft capable of carrying large payloads across the oceans. Indeed, the Army and Navy had secretly commandeered the seaplanes after the U.S. declaration of war, and periodically diverted them and their crews for military missions. Instructed to keep the timing of their flight a secret, the travelers arrived early that Sunday morning. At the check-in counter, Harry Seidel handed over a one-way ticket. The 52-year-old Standard Oil of New Jersey executive, sporting brand-new 14-karat gold cufflinks, had retained much of the fashionable looks and silky brown hair that had turned heads during his youth. His firm was now caught in its worst scandal in decades, due to revelations about its extensive ties to the German chemical corporation IG Farben. But Harry would not relinquish his position as one of the company's top overseas directors. Brokering high-level international oil deals had brought him an uncommon amount of wealth and social standing for the son of a small-town bakery owner. Ben Robertson, a proud Southern Baptist and Democrat with sensitive blue eyes and a lilting South Carolina accent, showed up from his Midtown hotel carrying a book by one of his favorite authors, Thomas Wolfe, was wearing a heavy silver identification bracelet, announcing his new affiliation with the New York Herald Tribune. A seasoned newspaperman, he had reported from Roosevelt's Washington, London during the Blitz, and Moscow under threat of invasion. But witnessing British colonial rule up close in India the previous fall had sorely tested his conviction that the Allies were merely fighting the good fight. That morning's news would have angered him. Despite growing concern about the deteriorating conditions of Mahatma Gandhi, 11 days into a hunger strike, and demanding immediate freedom for the subcontinent, the State Department reiterated that the United States would not intervene in a matter essentially British. This war's twisted logics, its fragile alliances and sometimes unsavory bargains, would not lend themselves easily to simple morality tales, though many like Ben had tried to make them. Other passengers filtered through the terminal's steel double doors, some with obvious purpose, others with an air of secret errands. The man looking after a padlocked pouch containing confidential documents was the State Department's James Wright. Couriers like him appeared on nearly every Clipper flight. William Walton Butterworth, a Princeton-educated Foreign Service officer known for his literary flair, also carried a briefcase stuffed with diplomatic business. He was spearheading an economic warfare operation on the Iberian Peninsula, buying strategic supplies off the black market so they did not fall into the wrong hands. Others' true objectives remain more of a mystery. Arthur Lee was a movie distributor who claimed credit for introducing American audiences to Alfred Hitchcock's films. Theodore Lamb, according to notations on Pan Am's manifest, was engaged in some kind of work for the Office of Civilian Defense. Security agents took special note of the appearance of Manuel Diaz. A touch short, with brown eyes encircled by spectacles, and dark hair that had salt and peppered with age, Manuel, Manolo to his close friends, had co-founded the most important shipping agency in the Spanish-speaking world. Vessels entrusted to his care had plied the waters between New York, Latin America, and the Iberian Peninsula since the First World War, and they had been aiding far-right activists at least since Francisco Franco's coup, which overthrew the Spanish Republic. Suspected of fascist sympathies, Manuel was arrested for smuggling oil and radio transmitters off a Brooklyn pier only days after the United States entered the war. But he escaped conviction, and his neutral boats still crisscrossed the Atlantic, sometimes transmitting information about Allied convoys to German submarines. At the terminal, inspectors carefully combed through his leather overnight bag, finding suits, neckties, handkerchiefs, bedroom slippers, pajamas, a toiletries kit, a Red Cross button, and miscellaneous correspondence, but nothing incriminating. By contrast, airport personnel had been taught not to second-guess the steady stream of U.S. military officials who arrived at the airport in the guise of civilians. The ruse gave the airline plausible deniability, although observers in neutral overseas ports were hardly fooled by the disembarking men, flashing regular passports, but parading through their territories in standard-issue shoes and haircuts with the obvious soldierly bearing, as one Irish intelligence agent put it. Today, 12 Army officers booked for the flight, including George Spiegelberg, posed as civil servants. Their names, ages, and home addresses left only the barest of clues about their former lives. Captain Joshua Edelman was the son of a Philadelphia plumber. Major Burton Mossman had grown up on a New Mexico cattle ranch. Later, when family members applied for their bonuses, or their headstones, other details, maybe true, would surface. Lieutenant Clifford Sheldon seemed to have been engaged in support operations for the U.S. Army Air Force's accelerating bombing raids on Europe's northwest coast. Major Earl Stoy, his relatives believed, had been assigned some kind of classified mission by the Quartermaster Corps. Given the unprecedented tooth-to-tail ratio in the U.S. military, only an estimated 16% of American uniformed personnel saw ground combat during World War II, and considering the vast array of technical, medical, administrative, logistical, and other non-combat work undertaken by Army officers around the world, the possibilities were vast. Reserving a seat on the Clipper took clout, distinguished professional standing, important contacts, and taken for granted deep-seated racial privilege. This was, after all, a conflict being fought with a segregated military that under-enrolled black Americans and steered the majority of those it did recruit into lowly manual labor positions, a practice that determined whose talents would be marshaled on behalf of the war effort and whose would be squandered, whose ideas would shape policies and U.S. relations with others, and whose insights would be dismissed while they packed, loaded, unloaded, tidied, dug, and buried. The least white person bound for Lisbon that day was the Italian-American crew member, Philip Casprini, referred to by one of the passengers as the Dark Steward. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine that international clipper travel during the war was sporadic, rare, or reserved for only an elite few. Pan Am's founding visionary, Juan Trippe, named his fleet of seaplanes after the speedy masted merchant ships that revolutionized ocean trade and travel the previous century. Indeed, What those legendary clippers had done with wind and sails, these airborne successors did with wings and oil, shrinking.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?